I do want to, sorry, I do want to say that I'm going to start just with one or two house rules because we're quite a large group. Um, the housekeeping would be please use the Q&A throughout the whole session. There will be JVR people responding to the questions that we can respond to, but those questions that's posted to Nicole, we will look at afterwards and definitely respond to them as well, even if it is by mail afterwards. The recording will be made available to everybody attending the session as well. So there will definitely be information that you want to spend a little bit more time on. We only have an hour of Nicole's time. So I can imagine that you'll make use of the recording. And then thirdly, keep your mobiles close because there will be one or two polls, which I think you would want to interact with as well. But on that note, Nicole, welcome to the webinar stage. I do want to say to everybody out there, Nicole Dickie is a industrial organizational psychologist and a senior consultant at Hogan. And I think what is amazing about her is that she's first of all known for the work that she does around cross-cultural leadership and development. But she mentioned it for those of you who joined earlier, but she lives and breathes it every day as well. So not only is she an expert on the study that she'll be presenting today, but she lives in Taipei, so she's based there. And I think it just really it deepens her understanding about the topic. So I don't want to, waste any more of your time, Nicole. I know that you've got a valuable information that you want to share with us today, and thank you for this opportunity. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Yanni. Thank you all for joining today. Allow me just a moment to share my screen. Make sure everybody can see it. All right. I hope you're able to see. Wonderful. I
Thank
got a
you.
nod from Yanni. Okay. Well, thank you all again for allowing me the opportunity to join. As Yanni shared, my name is Nicole Dickie. I am on Hogan's international distributors team. So I am based in Taipei, Taiwan, and I cover Greater China, South Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, and Vietnam, and have just had such a wonderful kind of cross-cultural experience prior living in mainland China and now in Taipei. And I'm thrilled to be sharing with you about some actually quite a few different data sources that Hogan Assessments has, with a real spotlight on some findings, some key initial findings on the South African market. So allow me to just kind of level set what we're going to be doing as we spend our time together. First, we're going to start out with a short kind of discussion interaction on cultural differences. Are these kind of stereotypes, cultural differences that we see, a reality or are they a myth? And this is where we'll actually set the stage on Hogan's point of view of leadership. We'll then move on to emergent leadership across the world, where we'll take a deep dive into Hogan's benchmark of executives from really around the world. We'll then move into effective leadership, sharing some initial findings from our study called the Global Leadership Effectiveness Study, or the GLESS. I'll probably be using that acronym and the title interchangeably throughout this session. A huge thank you to JVR at this point, and I'm sure I'll say this many times throughout the presentation. Thank you to many of you who have participated in the study already, as well as JVR for the partnership on this. And then finally, and I think most importantly here, we'll look at some spotlight on South African trends. I'm hoping that we have time for Q&A, but as Yanni said, please feel free to put that in the chat as we go. They're going to be monitoring the chat, and we'll make sure that your questions gets answered. If not today, then later on. Okay, so we're going to move into a very quick poll. So please use your phone or feel free to type in menti.com. You can see the code here. On the next slide, the code will also appear at the top, but now's your chance to scan the QR code. We are actually going to do a very quick poll now, as well as a couple of activities a little bit later on in the session. So please keep your mobile phone handy. Okay, I'm going to switch the screen, and now here are two questions that you'll see. Just help me level set. Are you currently using Hogan assessments in your organization? A simple yes or no. And Yanni, I'm going to look to you. Do you see this question for me? Okay.
Nicole, I actually got the first question. I
Oh, did
particularly got
you?
the second question, which I think might follow. Let's
Great.
see if yes, I got that question.
All
Uh,
right.
mm, so I've
Let's
not had
see.
the
That is very odd. I'm sorry about that, everyone. Let me restart it. It looks like we only have 3 people in here, so that makes me okay. Here we go. Are you currently using Hogan assessments in your organization? We've got a few, so thank you for your participation. Good. Now I can see we're moving now. This is really helpful for me in understanding kind of the background of the audience here. So thank you for this insight. This is wonderful. Good, good. Okay, so we've got a split. So thank you so much for participating. All right. I'll leave this just another couple of seconds. Great. So as we go through the session today, Hogan has a lot of scale names and terms, but I'll do my best to really define the constructs as we go. So don't worry if you're not familiar with Hogan. We'll still make it make sense. Okay, thank you so much for participating in that. I also want your insights. You guys are experts in the market. What's top of mind for your leadership in your organizations? Whoops. Okay, so what's the biggest concern for leadership right now in your organization? Is that identifying and selecting the right leaders, developing and coaching leaders, succession planning for key roles, or retention of those high potential leaders? Ooh, okay. It's looking like we're getting a winner of succession planning, but maybe not. Awesome. Just a minute or so more. Thank you so much for participating in this. This is really helpful for understanding where you are at in your organizations, what's top of mind for you as we continue on with today's session. So succession planning being a clear winner here. All right. So before and as we get started, the only thing I want to share is for those of you who may not be familiar with Hogan, Hogan is a global leader in the field of personality assessment and test publishing. So our founders, Dr. Robert Hogan and Dr. Joyce Hogan, really were pioneers in demonstrating that personality is actually can be a better predictor of job performance than cognitive tests without having the adverse impacts on minority groups. So they also showed that leadership has significant financial implications and that a leader's personality influences their leadership style as well as their potential for derailment. So at Hogan, we've conducted over 11 million assessments throughout 180 countries and territories and 50 different languages. Our global distribution network and solutions partners span 66 different markets and over 200 partners. And actually, today, our assessments are used by 75% of the Fortune 500 companies. And I just want to say we are so proud to work alongside JBR as our authorized distributor in South Africa for nearly 20 years. I believe it's 19 years. And their expertise and insights spans all of the topics that we just mentioned in that prior slide, including succession planning. They have that shared value towards research and providing relevant and timely and local insights. So again, couldn't be more thankful for this opportunity. All right, so we're going to dive in because we actually have a lot to cover. And we're going to start out with cultural differences. So you might be in an organization that is a South African organization going abroad, and it's really helpful to understand, you know, the culture or the experience that you're likely to have in the workplace in that new country. I can tell you from experience, having worked and lived in Greater China, but there are some stereotypes that we can often rely upon when we're going into these new locations. And so I have a few visual aids and that I'd like to share here. These visuals come from a graphic artist named Yang Liu, who is a Chinese artist based in Berlin. And so she is representing some leadership stereotypes that she's observed, or some leadership trends that she's observed in her life and work. The first is Western versus Eastern leadership on communication style. I don't know if you can guess the interpretation here, but on the left-hand side, we have, quote, Western leadership, and that's being straightforward, not beating around the bush, being willing to uh, uh, confront when needed. And, quote, Eastern leaders wanting to avoid confrontation, being more winding and not being straightforward. The next is the way that the leader views themselves. Western leaders being more assertive, liking to show off, maybe being a little bit more narcissistic. Eastern leaders being more humble and unassuming, not wanting to stand out. And then finally, Western leaders tending to be more democratic or, sharing the power, whereas Eastern leaders being more authoritarian, micromanaging, having that higher power distance. But what we can see from the personality data that I will be sharing in just a bit from over 180 markets is it's really starting to transform the way that we understand and identify leadership talent across cultures. And I'm here to tell you it's not as simple as West versus East and the stereotypes that we might have associated with those. I want to quickly give an example here. So when you see this slide, what culture comes to mind? I'm not really able to manage the chat quite as clearly as I'd like. So I'm just going to go ahead and say, maybe this is Japanese culture. Maybe it's Chinese culture. How would you see that? Well, the picture in the top left-hand corner, maybe that's Korean. The writing looks kind of like Japanese or Chinese. The bottom right-hand corner, the lanterns, that could be anywhere across Southeast Asia, China, Japan, right? Okay, Chinese culture, maybe. What about Chinese in Malaysia, right? How is Asian culture defined? And all these pictures are depicting cultural symbols, but it's really difficult to measure where does it start and stop? And how could we measure this from a workplace perspective? Okay, let's contrast that to country. What country is this? Many of you likely know this is China. This is mainland China. How do you know? Well, you probably see the flag, you see the money, you see the leader, President Xi Jinping, right? These boundaries are much more concrete and able to be defined. What we find is that modern political borders tend to represent shared socio-political movements, economic systems and trends, labor laws. And what we found in some research by some Hogan affiliates over the past decade or so is that we know organizations are generally set up according to a country or territory and bound by those external rules, laws, factors. So we at Hogan recognize that the organizations are going to be conforming to the external environment, as well are those leaders. So in combination with this, what we're seeing is that leaders with similar personality characteristics are emerging throughout organizations within a country. And again, the research that I mentioned, this gives the perspective of examining leader personality as an alternative way to consider leadership differences across these different countries and cultures without stereotyping, without oversimplifying. Based on some of Dr. Hogan himself, his research, as well as greater Hogan Assessments research, we see that organizations fail and success does hinge on its leadership. And a leader's personality and their values are going to be shaping their styles and behaviors, which then in turn have implications for both individuals as well as organizational performance. So I've just got a couple of examples of CEOs here from different banks, different industries, Mountain Group, Humba Iron Ore. And really, this is just to say we are going to be looking at the leadership trends of executives as the boundary for looking at across countries and cultures. Okay, so here's where I want to quickly define Hogan's perspective on leadership. From Hogan's perspective, leadership is an evolved solution for organizing collective behavior and with the goal of survival. And based on Dr. Hogan's socioanalytic theory, there's really two facets to leadership. And that's going to be the basis of kind of the rest of what we're talking about. The first is emergent leadership. This concerns rising to the top and winning the within group competition. These are the people who have the charisma oftentimes to stand out. And people say, oh, that person, they're leader like. I want to move them up, I want to promote them. The effective leaders, this concerns building a team and winning the between group competition. So these are the people who can build and maintain a high performing work group to meet the shared goal and achieve the goal. At a high level, leadership is a resource for the group and for the followers, and is not meant to be a source of privilege for the leader themselves. So, as we move forward today, we're first going to delve into leader emergence, look at the data there, and then later on, move on to leader effectiveness. So, a bit more on emergent leaders. Studying who emerges as a leader in a country or market can help us with a variety of things. First is understanding the expectations for those in the country, what they are thinking is leader like in that market. The behaviors that people might find tolerable, how followers might expect their leaders to communicate, to make decisions, to set strategy, and any expectations for what leaders in a country or market might value, might focus their efforts on. Really, what behaviors are rewarded and what behaviors are punished. Studying emergent leaders, however, can't really help us understand effectiveness, right? And this is not going to help us create any kind of leader success profile. But as we move forward, the way that we're looking at leadership is really the full spectrum of leadership. And the way that we're doing that is by using Hogan's 3 core inventories to really provide a very comprehensive look at leadership. So for those of you who might not be familiar with Hogan, I want to give a really high overview. What this looks like is 3 different aspects on personality. The first is the bright side of personality. This is going to be your everyday strengths and weaknesses, helping us understand, can you do the job? The next is the dark side of personality. This is often overused strengths. Maybe you're really good at something, but when it's overused, it can actually harm your career potential, harm the impact on others, and potentially get in your way of career success. And then finally is the motives, values, and preferences inventory, the MVPI, that looks at the inside of personality, your motives, your values, your drivers, what's going to get you out of bed in the morning, get you to work, the type of leadership culture you're likely to create, and some potential unconscious biases as well. As we go through the rest of the session, this is going to be the framework for the data that I'll present. So this leads me back to our cross-cultural myths. So do you remember what Yang Liu mentioned? Yes, she had her perspective, but I want to use our data to bust a few of these ideas, bust a few of these myths. So what you see here on the screen is a benchmark from our emergent leader benchmarks from around the world. And this is the Hogan personality inventory, or the bright side. And I want, oh, sorry about the box. What we see here from that first slide we saw from Yang Liu of the straight versus the curvy line, what we find is that not all Eastern cultures are afraid of confrontation. Actually, you can see here that mainland Chinese leaders are the lowest on interpersonal sensitivity, or being warm and diplomatic and tactful, conflict avoidant. But we actually see that Japanese and South Korean leaders don't fit this stereotype either. One more for you. at our motives, values, and preferences inventory, what we see is that not all Western countries are overly individualistic or only looking out for themselves. What we see here is that the US is moderately high on altruistic, wanting to help others, and Germany and Poland score quite high on affiliation or feeling belonging and connectedness to the group. Now, I know you might be using a keen eye to look at that yellow for South Africa, which is great. And you can reach out to JVR if you have more questions or want to look at the benchmark in a little bit more detail. Okay, so I had promised you to keep your phone close. So we have a quick activity about leadership trends. There's just going to be 2 questions, and I'm going to be using that benchmark of executives that I just briefly showed you to share some country specific leadership trends. I'd like you to guess the country that I'm referencing, the country's leaders I'm referencing. Spoiler alert here, South Africa is not one of the examples I'm sharing because I want to save your data for the end. So just 2 easy questions. The QR code's here in the bottom left-hand corner still. Okay, so you might not be familiar with Hogan scales. That's a-okay. I'm going to give you a quick bullet point overview here. So in this country, leaders are adopting a cautious, thoughtful approach to decision making. There's going to be a lot of evaluation of risks, deliberate actions. There's going to be less emphasis on assertiveness, and the leadership culture is valuing measured, steady approach over any kind of proactivity or aggressive style. The leaders are going to be rewarding individuals with safe, practical contributions, less emphasis on that outward confidence. Instead, a self reliant, risk averse mindset is going to be practical and effective. I'm going to give you 3 options. Which country's executives do you think that I am describing? Thai executives, Japanese executives, or Swiss executives? Ooh, okay. We're anchoring around Switzerland. I'll give it just another minute or so. All right. Thank you so much for participating. All right, those 9 of you, now 10 of you, the correct answer is these are Japanese executives. The hallmark of Japanese kind of potential derailing behavior is that high cautious. And if I don't know if any of you have worked within Japan or with any Japanese colleagues, but there's definitely a detail orientation that may come across as high diligent or being more micromanaging or perfectionistic, but actually it comes from this place of not wanting to fail and being really, really detail oriented to avoid risk, mitigate risk. Okay, one more. Okay, you can see here there's a little bit higher ambition, being more goal-oriented, a little bit higher learning approach, being analytical, interested in a variety of topics. I'll call out aesthetics is highest here, so valuing that form over function. What we see here is more orientation towards strong goals, innovative problem solving, continuous learning, and avoidance of structure. Leaders in this country are going to be more willing to test the limits, break and bend rules, charm their way out of trouble, maybe bringing attention to themselves along the way, and wanting to have that influence, brand, doing things together, and being deeply motivated by design and beauty. Okay, so any guesses? Italy, France, or Hungary? Oh, it's going to be a good split here. All right. Well, thank you all for your participation. It is France. You are correct. Although I like totally understand the potential emphasis on Italy, but yeah, France, that art and beauty, the high aesthetics, you can kind of see that throughout as well. So you can now put up your phone. You can close this window. No more activities on Menti. Thank you for your participation there. So understanding emergent leader data can really help us understand market-specific leadership styles. This is the data of who gets to the top. Who gets to the top is who's getting rewarded, and that gives us insights into preferences because the culture that you create is the behavior that you reward and punish. So this has valuable insights. You can see here on the screen from leadership styles to communications and decision making, conflict resolution. And really, we're able to do this at Hogan because our assessments are equivalent across all cultures and languages, meaning that we don't see meaningful difference in the population and how people are scoring on our assessments within countries and territories. So, meaning we see as many people scoring high, moderate, and low on ambition or power or sociability across the world. But then when we split the data by job levels or by territories, that's a different story. And really, that's what we're leveraging here. So we've understood leader emergence. I promised then we'd move to leader effectiveness. So we're understanding leader emergence across the globe. So what's next? Well, we're curious about perceptions of effective leadership, right? We know from Dr. Hogan and Hogan's um, research over the years that people evaluate their leaders based on 4 criteria most of the time. The first is integrity. So, does your employees see you honoring commitments, playing fair, telling the truth? Judgment. Are you making decisions quickly? And if you make the wrong decision, can you learn and make a new decision moving forward? Competence. Is the leader good at the business, have that kind of more technical expertise? And finally, vision. Is a leader able to explain why this matters? And so people intuitively know what makes a good or bad leader. Many of you on this call are psychologists and have this learned background. But if you ask an engineer, a librarian, a person on the street, what makes a good or bad leader, they probably have ideas that come from their own experiences, right? People intuitively know what they think about leadership. And so we wanted to find out what makes an effective leader. What do people think about leadership? And so what are we doing? We're asking the people who work for leaders. We're asking folks across the world who are, in all job levels, what do they think makes an ideal leader? And so here's where, again, I have to thank JVR so much for the partnership. We are partnering with Hogan's Global Distribution Network around the world. We're in the midst of a data collection on this topic. I'll explain a bit more about that in just a second. But in this data that I'm about to show, these are initial findings from our Global Leadership Effectiveness Study. We've got 10 countries and territories that we've included here. I've got all of our distributor network whose results are a part of this, who's been a part of this data collection. This includes South Africa, Germany, the UK, the US, Australia, Greater China, including Mainland China and Taiwan, India, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. And so what we've seen in our initial sample is that most are women, and we've got about a third at the individual contributor level. I wanted to say we have included all job levels because what we know is that people who are in middle management, who are in positions of leadership, still have their own ideas about leadership. And about 32% of the sample has come from business and support services. Okay, how are we doing this? We're using Hogan's personality-based job analysis tool. This is called the JET, or the Job Evaluation Tool. If I reference that, that's the acronym, excuse me. And this maps to Hogan's 3 inventories that I shared, as well as the Hogan competency model. And so we're asking participants, think about an ideal leader, an effective leader. And then we're presenting them with behavioral statements and asking them to rate it on a 5-point Likert type scale, from very bad to very good. In the rest of the presentation, I might mention mean scores So anything negative is going to be viewed as neutral to bad or very bad for job performance of an effective leader. Anything positive would be viewed as neutral to positive to very positive in terms of performance of an effective leader. And anything with about a mean of a +1, that's going to be showing that anchoring around respondents really solidly believing that this behavioral tendency is good for effective leader performance. We use two sections in these initial findings. The bright side of personality, you'll see me use FFM five-factor model because the HPI corresponds to the five-factor model. And then the dark side personality traits, which corresponds to the Hogan Development Survey. Okay, so we have at a high level 4 different research questions, basically asking, are there similarities and differences? And if so, where? So you can see research question 1 is, are there similarities in who people are perceiving to be effective leaders across all countries and territories? That answer is yes. Let's talk about where. So on the five-factor model, on the bright side, we see that there are no statistically significant differences between countries and territories in beliefs that effective leaders should be calm, even-tempered, and resilient. So adjustment has a mean of about 0.75, so moderately endorsed as positive for performance. On the right-hand side, learning approach or being analytical, studious, well-learned has a mean of a 0.9. So across the world, there's alignment. There's no statistically significant differences, that these are positive for performance. In general, though, we do see a general trend across all countries and territories that all the bright side scales are being viewed as positive for performance. How positive or how positive you think it is, how positively you endorse it, depends on the country or territory you're coming from, which is what we'll talk about in just a minute. Also, interestingly, on the dark side personality, we see that there are no statistically significant, excuse me, the only scale where there are statistically significant, I said that incorrectly, my apologies. There are no statistically significant differences on one scale, and that is cautious. So there's alignment that cautious, being risk averse, indecisive, overly careful, fearing failure, that's aligned across the world, that is solidly unhelpful for leader performance with a mean of a -1. But we do see a trend that the moving away scales, which include excitable, skeptical, cautious, reserved, and leisurely, that basically means that in times of stress and pressure, those leaders are going to be pulling away from each other. They might use a variety of strategies to do that, being emotionally volatile, being skeptical of others, um, being risk averse, being, closing yourself off emotionally, or being passive aggressive. These are all viewed as negative. Additionally, we also see that bold or being arrogant, entitled, aggressive, unwilling to listen to feedback is also viewed as generally negative. There are statistically significant differences across different countries and territories, though, on those except for cautious. The only ones that I'll call out as especially relevant here is on excitable. So South African and US respondents are more off put by that moodiness and volatility when compared to Hungarian respondents. The other is on leisurely. We find that Czech and South African respondents are more off put by passive aggressiveness than mainland Chinese respondents. But that's my only teaser for South Africa right now, because we have a whole section on it. All right, now let's look at the second research questions. Are there differences where people are perceiving effective leadership, and what characteristics are showing those differences? Here's where the answer is yes. And on the bright side, we see minor but statistically significant differences on ambition, on getting along scales, and decision-making styles. For ease of the conversation, we're going to do a little bit deeper look on the getting along scales, because when you do go into a new country or territory, one of the most salient pieces of the experience upon entry is how people are communicating to you. So it's an easy way to see these clear differences. So you can see on the left-hand side, there is sociability. On the right-hand side is interpersonal sensitivity. In Hogan language, we often call this getting along. And so we see that in general, sociability is a little bit less endorsed as important. It's not viewed as important for effective leadership. But we do see that German, Hungarian, and Greater Chinese respondents think effective leaders should spend more time building those networks, acting more gregarious, developing their social networks, communicating proactively, whereas Australian, US, and South African respondents are not endorsing that as strongly. Then on interpersonal sensitivity on the right-hand side, this is the scale that deals with being warm, diplomatic, tactful. What we see is a split with Greater China actually not endorsing that as highly. So both mainland Chinese and Taiwanese respondents are not finding this warmth and diplomacy as important. A quick tidbit, remember when I showed you all that crazy data, it was really difficult to read, but called out that mainland Chinese respondents, excuse me, mainland Chinese leaders tend to be lower on interpersonal sensitivity. This is just an interesting note that the employees, or at least the respondents in our sample, didn't need that warmth and tact. Okay, here is maybe the most interesting finding is looking at the dark side and where there are differences. What we actually find is that there are differences in the view of helpful versus harmful when it comes to some derailing behaviors. So on the scale colorful, that tends to be in times of stress and pressure, being really attention seeking, self promoting, maybe not being as willing and able, ready to listen. And on the right hand side, diligent, in times of stress and pressure, being a little bit more micromanaging, perfectionistic, in the weeds and in the details. What we find on colorful on the left hand side is that Greater Chinese respondents are seeing that they kind of like the charisma, the dramatic behavior, the self promotion. At least they don't find it negative. It's more value neutral to positive. And then on diligent, what we see is that Indian, South African, Hungarian, and Greater Chinese respondents, particularly Taiwanese respondents, think that exhibiting those perfectionistic, detail orientation, micromanaging behaviors actually are good for the ideal leader. They help. And if you look at the very right hand side, Taiwan has a mean of about zero point 0.7. So it's like very solidly viewed as positive by respondents. Okay, so findings across the globe, to summarize this, on the bright side, there is general alignment that the bright side scales are good for effective leadership, and we see alignment on adjustment and learning approach. On the dark side, there's general alignment that the moving away scales and bold are bad for effective leadership, no differences on cautious, but more key practical differences on colorful and diligent. So effective leader data in this capacity can help us as well. A lot of these are similar, helping us understand employees' preferred leadership style, what the followers care about, communication style preferred by employees, decision-making style preferred by employees, etc. But as you can also likely tell, there are some clear limitations to this research study. What if employees say they really want a tactful leader, right? Interpersonal sensitivity, but maybe they actually want a leader who won't be honest with them or hold them accountable. So the reality with this study design is that there is not a criterion variable. So we're not able to say that perceptions of effective leadership is related to positive leader performance. But I do want to just put out there, Hogan has started discussing an opportunity for a more targeted data collection with a client to understand this link between the perceptions and leader performance using Hogan's job analysis tool, the JET, as I mentioned, and our performance criterion form. And that really just helps us do our best to eliminate some of the organizational politics that are often inherent within performance reviews. So I also want to put out there right here that JVR has done some really amazing research with South African leaders looking at leader performance. So looking at the bright side scales in leader performance. And they'd be more than happy to share that research with you. And they're always open to partnering for research if you are at an organization or have a client who would be interested in a research partnership. So if we go back to thinking about Hogan's point of view on leadership, even if we don't have the criterion variable in this study, we still know that leadership is viewed as a resource for the group. And if for employees to view, the group as successful, what do they need from their leader? What's going to be that resource? It's still valuable to find, it's valuable to understand what the team or organizations find desirable in their leaders. Okay, so now the most fun part. So we're going to take these two data sources, okay, our leader benchmarks and the GLES, the Global Leadership Effectiveness Study, and do a deeper dive, a spotlight on South Africa. So I'll first start out sharing South Africa's Global Leadership Effectiveness Studies, and then layer on the benchmark. So our Emergent Leader Benchmark features over 350 executive leaders, that's CEO, that's C-suite level, from across a variety of industries in South Africa. So banking and financial services, industrials, IT, retail, telecom, and more. Okay, so based on the respondents that we have in these initial findings, we see that um, the highest means fall on three scales. Ambition, having that drive, accomplishing big goals, pursuing tasks until completion. This is a mean of a positive 1.15. So respondents solidly sharing this as good for leader performance. Next is interpersonal sensitivity. So that's that speaking tactfully, diplomatically, being sensitive to the needs of others, having warmth. This is a mean of a 1.11. Again, solidly good. Lastly is inquisitive. We've heard a little bit less about this scale up to this point, but this is really thinking strategically, being curious, focusing on the long term, having a big picture view, and that's right around a 1. But what we see in this data is that learning approach has nearly a 1, a 0.93, prudence, which is more of that process orientation, also has a 0.88, adjustment, a 0.81. So many of these are being really closely endorsed to solidly good for performance. The lowest mean here is actually on sociability, that building networks, behaving gregariously. This is a mean of a 0.36. So it's viewed as neutral to positive for leader performance. Generally, this is not as valued by the respondents in South Africa. Then let's look at the benchmark of executives. These are South African leaders of organizations today. And what we see is there's really overall quite a good match with employees' expectations. So what we see in the South African data is that ambition tends to be high. So leading with that drive and ambition, interpersonal sensitivity is moderate. So leaders coming across as moderately friendly, but still able to voice opinions, confront conflict, not conflict averse. Moderate high, inquisitive, and learning approach. So focusing on that big picture and long term, as well as staying up to date on the latest trends, being a continuous learner, a traditional learner. So you can see I just put on some little GLES approved or GLES consideration as we kind of integrate these data sources. If there was one area of opportunity or an area for consideration for South African leaders, it's on HPI, interpersonal sensitivity. So this is where there's a potential gap. Real world South African executives are scoring moderate, whereas South African respondents are saying when we think about effective and ideal leaders, we want someone providing that warmth. We want someone speaking diplomatically. And that's what we think of when we think of positive leader performance. So as a potential consideration, shaping communication style just to suit the needs of the organization, warming up that communication style as needed. Okay, and then we go to the dark side of leadership. So what we see is that South African respondents find the following behaviors as harmful for leader performance. First is displaying emotional stability and volatility. We see that excitable has the lowest mean of a negative 1.44. So respondents are seeing this as between bad and very bad for leaders to be moody, inconsistent, volatile, and unpredictable. The next is succumbing to that decision paralysis or indecision, cautious, has a mean of a negative 1, which really aligns with that global trend of being risk averse and fearing failure as being seen as solidly bad for performance. Agreeing outwardly, but being inwardly resistant or doing something else in actuality that's leisurely, that has a mean of a negative 1.16. And the interquartile range, which is that middle 50% of the data, is quite tight. So it shows more alignment in this data set that being stubborn, being passive aggressive is, agreed upon as bad for performance. And then finally, acting entitled, not considering feedback. Bold has a mean of a negative 1.27. Again, solidly bad for leader performance. Interestingly, which we pointed out a bit earlier, diligent. So those tendencies towards micromanaging, perfectionism, being nitpicky is viewed as neutral to positive. It's a mean of a 0.36, which is actually, for reference, is the exact same mean as HPI sociability. So that neutral to positive. Okay, so when we look at South African leaders' tendencies, derailing tendencies, what we see is actually moderate cautious. So this is not a high risk derailer, and the behaviors that might be associated would still be open to experimentation, not really fearing that failure, being emotionally poised. The higher risk derailers are mischievous and imaginative. What that looks like is being more risk taking, limit testing, potentially engaging in manipulation to get your way. Imaginative is being unconventional in your ideas, but maybe not bringing your team along to, you know, help them action on those ideas, as well as potentially lacking follow through. And what we see when we look back at the South African respondents' means on these two, mischievous has a mean of a negative 0.43. Imaginative has a mean of a negative 0.66. So these scales are not viewed as harmful for leader performance comparatively. Next, we look at diligent. What we find in the leader benchmark is that diligent is moderate high. So there is that tendency towards being more planful, being more structured, leaning into that being a bit more inflexible, managing, nitpicking, perfectionistic. We haven't talked much about dutiful, but low dutiful behaviors usually would be described as being self-reliant, maybe even being willing to challenge authority. And so we actually see that it's aligned pretty well with what South African respondents want. You're not seeing that high risk cautious. So that's good. That's aligned. Um, you're seeing South African respondents are saying diligent behaviors are positive, not not very good or good, but neutral to positive. And then finally on dutiful, this was aligned as well. Low risk, which is good because it's not viewed as positive. Okay, one thing I want to share here, you can see that we have not yet analyzed the motives, values, and preferences inventory data for the global leadership effect in the study, but I wanted to pull this benchmark and just share with you on the tendencies that we see in current South African leaders. First, we see that recognition need is low. So there might be more of a preference toward these behind the scene roles in current leaders. But power is high. So there's a strong value on influence, on succeeding, on achieving. Affiliation tends to be lower. What we see is that there's more of a preference towards independence or even privacy, not needing that belonging or that collaboration as a value or driver. Next is tradition. So there is a value on maintaining tradition, on social customs, on acceptable behaviors, as well as commerce. There's that high desire to earn and turn a profit. And what we find with this is, organizations, leaders in organizations might create these cultures of structure and results driven with this emphasis on goals and emphasis on productivity, on performance metrics, including commercial metrics, high tradition and respect, where norms and customs are respected. Change might be a bit slower or at least very carefully considered. There might be more privacy and independence. Collaboration might occur in smaller groups. Autonomy might be more treasured or prized. And then there might be a tendency towards a professionalism with clear boundaries. Roles and boundaries being maintained. Leadership may come across as a little bit more formal or reserved. So as I finish out, I want to do one more little look at South African organizations that might be going global. So I looked per the World Bank, South Africa's top export and import partners include China, the US, Germany, Japan, and the UK. So I want to share a few findings when it comes to comparing respondents from South Africa on the Global Leadership Effectiveness Study and respondents from other countries. And this is just going to help South African leaders have some really actionable takeaways if and as you're working cross culturally, leading a team cross culturally, especially. Okay, so first we have South Africa versus mainland China. So here's where we're going to see more of these differences in expectations for leaders. The first is in our expectations of getting along. As we already showed a little bit earlier, mainland Chinese respondents almost are flipped on those two scales of sociability and interpersonal sensitivity. So Chinese respondents are endorsing sociability as significantly higher than South African respondents. They want that more gregarious extroversion in their leaders, and endorsing interpersonal sensitivity as significantly lower than South African respondents. Additionally, there's some different expectations in like the tactical versus the strategic, particularly on inquisitive. Mainland Chinese respondents are saying this is not inquisitive, being curious, big pictured, open minded. That's not as important to us in our leader. And then lastly, on the HDS, we see some differences in leisurely or that passive aggressive behavior and, quote, the charismatic cluster. Now, we haven't talked really in depth about the charismatic cluster, but basically, these are the influence derailers. The moving against, being willing to use your charm, use your enthusiasm, dramatics to sort of influence in certain ways. And what we find is that South African respondents are endorsing leisurely, mischievous, and colorful as much worse than for performance than Chinese respondents. So, what does this mean? Here are some considerations and key takeaways for South African leaders. So, if you are leading a team in mainland China, here are some things to consider. Prioritizing socializing across the team and organization and building networks strategically. To come across as more leader like, there needs to be a little bit more of an emphasis on that sociability. Communicating straightforwardly. This might even feel blunt compared to coming from the market that you're in. But as I've already shared, leaders in mainland China tend to communicate with lower interpersonal sensitivity. They're able to not avoid conflict. They're willing to take these heads on. So feel comfortable that actually that's expected in the market. Next is focusing on the tactical over the strategic. There's not as great of an influence. Excuse me. There's not as great of an emphasis on inquisitive. And actually, what we found um, today and even 10 years ago in the leader benchmark for mainland Chinese leaders, we actually see them being higher on prudence. So being more process oriented, more rule abiding, more in the details. So feel free to focus more on the tactical over the strategic when leading a team in mainland China. And finally, even being open to leaning into those more risk-taking or charismatic tendencies when appropriate. As I had shared, the higher risk derailers for South African leaders tend to be that risk-taking, tend to be those ideas that actually can be well received, better received in mainland China. Okay, last one. So here we have South Africa versus the US, Germany, and the UK. At a high level, the opposite's true. Just kidding. It's not that straightforward. But there are different expectations around process and details. So what we find is that South African respondents are endorsing prudence as more important for an effective leader than German and US respondents. Additionally, as I had already shared, South African respondents are endorsing diligent, those micromanaging perfectionistic tendencies are better for performance than UK, German, and US respondents. Then when we look at sociability, we actually see that South African respondents are saying this is less important to us than German respondents. So what does this mean If you are going to be leading a team in the US, in Germany, in the UK, consider and be mindful of coming across as potentially overly detailed, micromanaging, or in the weeds. The South African market, or the respondents at least in our study, are saying that this is positive for leader performance, being in the weeds, being in the details. But what we see in these markets, US, Germany, and the UK, they're saying no, this is viewed as poorly for effective leadership. And then finally, if you're going to be working with a team in Germany, um, again, working to expand that social comfort zone, socializing across the team, building diverse networks, what we see in the leader emergent benchmark in Germany is they're very high affiliation and high sociability. So the leaders that are in Germany are going to be having lots of touch points. They're going to be connecting with their teams. So that's really what's viewed as leader like in the German market. So, because South African leaders don't tend to be as high on affiliation and the market doesn't tend to prioritize sociability as highly, just being aware of expanding that social comfort zone. Okay, so I know I'm almost at my time. Just a couple of key takeaways here. In general, the behavioral tendencies of South African leaders actually align really well with the beliefs of ideal leaders. If anything, number two, South African leaders could consider warming up the communication style to meet those preferences of South African employees. But I know that JVR has done the study into effective leadership from a performance perspective, and I think they have more to say on this. But this is just a consideration based on our data. And then finally, when you're interacting cross culturally, consider adapting the leadership style towards the preferences of that country or territory. And JVR can help to share this data and support. And then finally, just a reminder, I know we know this, but individual differences still matter. You might be working with a leader or coaching a leader that has a completely different profile, right? That still matters. There's still nuance. And ways to coach them to develop that strategic self-awareness. We don't want to lose the individual in the aggregate. So individual differences still matter. And as I close, if you haven't, you're absolutely welcome to participate in the Global Leadership Effectiveness Study today. It takes about 10 to 15 minutes. It is a detailed questionnaire, but of course, it gets us a lot of really rich insights into your experiences and expertise. I think that Yanni and the team can share more on this, but if you happen to be working with a client or a part of an organization that's interested in getting their organization's data on the glass, you're welcome to contact JVR. We can work together um, to really be able to provide some insights into employees' perspectives, particularly on engagement. We require 10 participants just to ensure confidentiality and anonymity for the participants. And then finally, please stay tuned for global findings, including the values side. This is slated to come to market by the end of the year, and it'll include findings from around the globe, even more markets than I shared today, with insights including the MVPI, which I think the values piece will provide some really meaningful insights for engaging employees in a particular market. Okay, I think we may not have time for questions. Sorry
Yes, your
about that.
timing is no, not at all. Nicole, your timing is absolutely spot on with a minute to go. I do want to just mention if you've got any burning questions, there weren't a lot shared in the chat, but if there's questions that you want to either pose to Nicole or to us, please reach out to us. Nicole did speak about the research that we did around the topic of leadership effectiveness, which we will be more than happy to share. And the same goes towards if anybody would want to take part in the study, it is still running up until the end of July or June.
Yes,
Is it
that's
June?
exactly right. July.
Yes, July. So please reach out. You can, just for those of you who are familiar with Hogan, you can access a career report. Anybody can take part. You don't need to be a psychologist, any of your clients. And if you've got 10 or more people who takes part in it, as Nicole explained, we can actually pull your aggregated data, which then gives you a view of how people view what is important for leadership in your organization or in your client's organization. So that would be, as I mentioned, available to you up until the end of July, and then going forward won't be anymore. So Nicole, this was brilliant. I think really we really appreciate the input, the effort, and especially the effort from Hogan's side to really make sense of leadership, because I think globally leadership is something that we are not necessarily always getting right. Just looking at some
Yeah.
politicians, globally as well, it is something that we need to understand better. And I think initiatives like this is absolutely brilliant to take part in, and we'll be taking part in this going forward as well. All
Thank you
questions,
so much,
please
Yanni.
send through to us, everybody, and we'll make sure that Nicole gets that as well. Wonderful. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
everybody, for attending as well.
Lovely to get the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much.